Welcome back to Bindwaves. I'm Kevin, and I'm a Fort Worth Bind member.
And hi, I'm Carrie, stroke survivor and Bind member.
We are happy to welcome Jasmine to talk about disabilities and voting rights. She started as a volunteer here with us at Bind, and when she had the opportunity to join the staff, she jumped on in. Welcome, Jasmine.
Hi, thank you for having me.
We're glad you're here.
Glad you're here.
Welcome to Bindwaves, the official podcast of the Brain Injury Network of Dallas. I'm Brian White, Bind's Executive Director. On each episode, we'll be providing insight into the brain injury community. We'll be talking to members and professionals regarding their stories and the important role of Bind's Clubhouse. We work as a team to inspire hope, community, and a sense of purpose to survivors, caregivers, and the public. Thank you for tuning into Bindwaves. Let's get on with the show.
Tell us a little bit about you and what got you interested in voting rights.
Yeah, so a little bit about me. I started at Bind as an intern back in 2018 for my undergraduate program. And so I finished my semester with everyone here and then graduated. And then shortly after, like in December or January of the next year, I saw that there was a position open. So I immediately emailed Valerie and was like, oh, I'm so glad to see this. I'll be sending my application. And yeah, since then I've been at Bind and I've really enjoyed my time here. And then as far as like my personal interest in voting rights, I know at Bind, so one of the work units is outreach and advocacy. It's always been one of my favorites. And in the past, I know members have gone, to the Capitol, to Austin, to kind of meet with different representatives and talk about brain injury and funding in the state of Texas. And so, but we didn't do anything related to voting. But it's kind of a really important thing that every member can participate in, even if they're not, the greatest public speaker. They can't get to Austin to do some of those, big advocacy events. So we kind of started that up, and yeah, it's just been going ever since.
Well, we're glad that you kind of brought that back to us. So kind of on a generic level, I guess, I know every state should have disability rights, or rights for those people with disabilities. Does it differ state by state? Or is it pretty generic and uniform across the states?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there's definitely like federal, countrywide rules, right? So we have like the ADA, so that requires that people with disabilities have, full inclusion and be able to vote. And then there's different acts that, require that there is an accessible voting machine in every polling location, and that's a federal law, or that, polling places be accessible and stuff like that. And then statewide, there's a few other different rules. So like in Texas, for example, you are allowed to have assistance with either reading the ballot or with voting in general, like with marking the ballot, having like interpreters. So whether that's a different language or whether that's like a sign language interpreter, being able to vote curbside if you're not able to physically enter the polling place, having a really robust like vote by mail system, right, that has like those policy and procedures set in place so that those ballots can be counted for. And then also having like an ID exemption law. So in Texas, if you can't get an ID for whatever reason or not able to like update your ID because of maybe a disability, you are able to like fill out a form, and it's kind of a long process, but you are, able to say, I can't get an ID for this reason, and you're able to vote anyways.
Yeah, I know that when I did curbside voting last year, just kind of random, they made my dad get out of the car, so they wouldn't let him be in the car with me. But I mean, I understand like if I'm blind and maybe need someone to read to me, then that's good. But yeah, I thought it was kind of funny. I was like, Dad, you have to get out of the car in the cold and wait for me to vote.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because I know other members have mentioned that they've been able to vote, with the person in the car, and that they even offered it to the person in the car with them, even if, that person wasn't technically eligible, because you're already there, you're already doing curbside. So first, it really depends, on like the specific, election workers, election officials that are at that polling site, kind of what they want to do with that. But I'm glad you were able to do curbside. Yeah.
So can I ask, if you have a physical disability, whether it be the inability to read or the physical disability and not being able to do whatever you have to do when you vote, do they provide someone to help you, or do you have to have someone?
That's a great question. So it is up to the person. They can opt to have a poll worker assist them. And I think it's, one poll worker during early voting and then 2 poll workers during the actual election day, or to have their own person. And then with that, it can really be any person. That person doesn't have to be a U.S. citizen even. But there is 3 exceptions to that. So it can't be your employer, can't be a union representative, and there's a third one that I'm forgetting. But yeah.
Someone that could kind of sway your vote.
Yeah. And they all also, currently it's a little bit we'll find out if this law is still in place with the next few court decisions, but they are required to take an oath to, saying that they're not going to influence your vote, and that they're only going to mark the ballot in the way that you pass them to.
Wow. What qualifies a person as having a disability and being able to request an accommodation, and what kind of accommodations do they make for people with disabilities?
Yeah, so in terms of who qualifies as a person with disabilities, there's not a list of specific diagnoses, and it's only if you're on this list do you qualify. It's really up to that person too, because someone may have a brain injury even and not necessarily need an accommodation or need that extra assistance, but they're certainly entitled to it. And so it's really up to that person to determine whether or not their disability requires them to have that extra support or that accommodation. So yeah, up to that person. And I always like to tell members too, when they go in and they're asking, I need this help, or I can't stand in line, can I sit inside, or something like that, that they don't need to disclose their disability to the poll worker. And that goes for everything too. I mean, even with parking in an accessible parking spot, if someone comes up to you and is prove to me that you're disabled, or something like that, you don't have to tell them anything. You've got the placard, you're good to go.
I was gonna say, well, you do have to have the placard.
Yeah, you do have to have that, but because not everyone has a disability that's visible, especially with brain injuries, right? Some of our members, they do have very physical disabilities, or they use a mobility aid, and so that's a very physical representation. But there's some other members who outwardly seem like nothing has happened. So it's really up to that person. And then that's the other thing is, you do need to ask for it. It's not going to be assumed to give it to you. So it's a great opportunity for members to practice that self-advocacy and practice asking for what they need, even if that doesn't include, spilling their whole life story to that person.
Sure. I mean, absolutely. It sounds like the accommodations are there. We just need to speak up for ourselves like we do in general with everything. But so I'm sure there's always still more that could be done. And what kind of improvements do you feel could be made to facilitate voting rights for people with disability, like funding, laws, etc.? And what could we do as brain injured survivors to help get that ball rolling?
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot that can be done. In other states, they have automatic voter registration when you turn 18. So as soon as you're eligible to vote, you're able to just go in. Or other states will have things such as same-day registration, or even universal mail-in voting. Just really makes it accessible for everyone to vote. And those are some things that, the state of Texas could consider. Having things like drop boxes for mail-in ballots as well, and even polling locations, where they're located at. Not only the physical accessibility of the buildings, which recent reports, usually estimate that to be around 60% of polling places are inaccessible in some way. But then also, where they're physically located in the community. Just to cite a recent example, I think it was College Station that said that they weren't going to have a polling place at A&M, which is super huge population of people in the city that vote and are registered to vote. But things like that happen all the time. The nearest polling place is 20 minutes away, or it's really hard to get to unless you have a car. You can't get there on public transit or stuff like that. And then also just, reducing voter ID laws to make it a little bit more flexible for people with disabilities to vote. So I know in Texas, if you're over a certain age, and I don't want to say the wrong age, you can have your ID be expired for as long as whenever. It could be super duper old. And then for different versions, it's it can be 5 years expired. But, having some flexibility in there, because sometimes, people aren't able to get to the DMV to register that every year when there's changes, when they move or a name has changed or something like that.
Right.
So, knowledge is power. So, how could voters with disabilities research candidates that would have an agenda for inclusiveness?
Yeah, so, and you mentioned this earlier in your other question, Carrie, and I totally didn't answer it, but I'll answer it with this one too, which was like how members can get involved. So, yeah, one, voting and like being informed, and there's a ton of online resources that members can use to kind of research who's on their ballot. So one thing that we share actually with our presentation every year is this website from the Secretary of State called like Who Represents Me, because you go into the ballot, you don't necessarily know or have heard of all 30 offices that are on there. You might not know like what state district you're in, what state Senate district you're in, what state board of education district that you're in. And so you use this Who Represents Me website, type in your address, and it'll tell you what district you're in, who the representatives are for all that district. And so then you can use that information. Okay, who is your representative now? Who else is running? And then kind of go from there. So if there's a news source that you trust, I know like Texas Tribune, Dallas Morning News, a lot of those like big newspapers will do their own voting guides every year. And then you can also kind of search. Different organizations will have like a set of questions that they give to every candidate. So I know I personally use like the League of Women Voters has like a sample ballot, and you can like pick everyone and then print it out, which is really helpful. And then you're able to kind of compare and see, what they answered the question or if they didn't answer the questions. And you can use ones from different places because they'll all ask, the candidates different questions and kind of compare from there. And then if you have more questions, going to those individual candidates' platforms and going onto their websites. But and then to add on to that as well, looking all that up beforehand, and you're actually allowed to have paper ballots or notes or things like that with you, because I couldn't even remember all 30 people. I get in there and I'm like, oh dang it, I thought I was going to be able to just kind of pick the names and remember who all, but having it written out or typed out or anything is super helpful as well. But then to answer your other question about what members can do is after voting, is giving feedback to those polling places and letting them know this place was accessible, this place was not accessible, or I wasn't able to use the accessible voting machine here, or they told me that I couldn't vote, or something like that, and reporting that information so that, the state election offices can use that feedback and make changes.
So real quick, it is okay to take a piece of paper there with everything that you want to vote for.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Whether it's like an official, sample ballot that you print out or just a list of names in the offices, you are allowed to have paper notes with you.
Great. Just take a quick little pause just to remind everyone, please go ahead and click that like button. If you're on YouTube, hit the notify button, and remember to share when you're done listening to us. Let all your friends know. So we're going to get back to Jasmine. So I know a couple of weeks ago, maybe about a month ago, we participated in, there was a week set aside specifically to advocate for disability rights and voting. And we reached out to the city of Plano to ask them to help share that and support us in that effort. So along those lines, what other progress has been made in advocacy for voting rights for people with disabilities? I mean, I know that's a big, we're trying to advocate for ourselves, but we could get other people to help us too. That'd be great.
Yeah, so there's a few things. So the voting accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act kind of requires to people or services that provide state-funded and federal funded services that provide services to people with disabilities that they're required to help, register those voters as well. And so Bind doesn't fall under that necessarily because we're a nonprofit, but it is still super important for us and for other brain injury clubhouses to make sure that we're addressing the advocacy component of our clubhouses as well. But then just statewide, there's some really great organizations. So that Disability Rights Voting Week that you mentioned was an association with the American Association of People with Disabilities and their campaign, which is called Rev Up. And then Rev Up has their own chapter in Texas. There's Disability Rights Texas, which is the official disability advocacy, legal representation for the state. They do tons of great work with everything related to disability in Texas. And then there's also REACH, which is in Plano. So every city or county, maybe in Plano, has a community for independent living or center for independent living. And so they also do a lot of advocacy work for whatever region that they're in. So there's a lot of local advocacy groups made up of people with disabilities that are doing a lot of that work, especially here in Texas.
That's wonderful.
Well, thinking of how many people are unable to get to the polling places, and so what are the general mail-in voting requirements, and can you kind of explain the process?
Yeah, so it's different than in Texas than it is in other states. So in Texas, there's a few requirements. One, you have to be, already registered to vote, already eligible, and then you have to either be a person with a disability, over the age of 65 or older, be away, like if you're in the military or something, you're not going to be in the state of Texas, or for another reason where it's not just a vacation, maybe, or if you are in like prison or jail, but you haven't been convicted of a felony, so you still have your right to vote. So you have to follow under those requirements, and then every year you have to fill out an application to vote by mail. So it's not just enough to be registered, you have to fill out that application. It's every year, and on that application you will write what elections you want to receive ballots for. So you can either select, annual application, I want them for the whole year. If it's a primary election year, you'll have to pick, what party you want that primary for. And then if you want any runoff elections. So if you fill it out at the beginning of the year and you only want May or March, depending on if it's like a uniform election or a primary, and then you want the one in November, you'd have to fill it out again and make sure that you select November. Wow. If you don't pick, annual the first time. So that's kind of the process, and then there's certain dates that you need to have that application in by. Once you get the ballot, a certain day that you have to have that ballot sent back in. And then there's a bunch of other laws or rules really with, how it's filled out, what information needs to be on there, how you send it back and stuff like that.
Yeah. It's a pretty easy process though.
Yeah.
But I would just kind of, as we kind of get towards the end here, what advice would you give to a person with disabilities who's just reluctant to vote because of perceived barriers? I know some people just don't like to admit they're disabled, but we really need everyone to vote. So what kind of advice would you give those that just kind of are like shy or scared that they're not going to? It sounds like to me mail-in is probably the best. But
Yeah. If you are able to do mail-in, then that's great. If you're a person who, wants to go in person, then you should be able to do that as well. And people with disabilities, I don't think I mentioned this, but it's, the largest minority group in the United States. It's 1 in every 5 people. And then the other thing is it intersects across all groups, right? So people of different genders, different ethnicities, different races are all included in this group. It's a very diverse group of people. But they're also one of the groups that has one of the lowest voting turnouts. So it's really important, if you're able to go and vote, to do that. And so my advice would be, especially if are a member at Bind, would be to ask questions. And one of the things I love that we do is that we get the chance to go and vote together as a group. And there's really that power, I think, in knowing, like, if you're worried about someone kind of giving you a hard time, is there's other members there to back you up, or the staff, will go there as well and be able to say, hey, this person should be able to vote, and kind of help them advocate for themselves, but also, practicing that. You don't necessarily have to wait until you're in the polling place to use those self-advocacy skills, kind of using them on a smaller level and kind of building up that confidence. And then also, the education part, knowing what you can ask for, how to ask for it. We've done like the kind of role-playing stuff at Bind where we'll do the scenarios and I'll be a mean election worker and kind of dramatize it for the members, but kind of makes it funny too. It makes it easier for the members to be able to practice that in real life.
Thank you, Jasmine, so much for that. We got a little confused here for a second. We want to thank you again so much for joining us and for the information on voting. And we're hoping this gets out in time that we can just tell everyone, even if you're not disabled, that you continue to go and vote and do it. It is your right. See, we got new shirts. Woohoo! Also, if you would like more information about Bind or about our podcast, or would like to share anything with us, we have an email address. It's bindwaves@thebind.org, bindwaves@thebind.org.
Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and also hit that notify button on YouTube while listening to Bindwaves. You can find us on all your favorite channels. Stay tuned for the next episode.
Until next time, guys.
Until next time.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Bind Waves and continue to support Bind and our nonprofit mission.
We support brain injury survivors as they reconnect into the life, the community, and their workplace.
And we couldn't do that without great listeners like you. We appreciate each and every one of you. Continue watching. Until next time.
Until next time.